The Healthcare Labyrinth podcast is back for another episode. Join Mark S. Ryan, a veteran health plan and health technology executive, as he explores the world of healthcare.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. My name is Mark Ryan, and it's a pleasure to be hosting the podcast. And thanks to everyone for listening in. This podcast is airing on January 17th, just before President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration. Last week on January 10th, the podcast covered the 2024 Healthier Year in Review and our 2025 predictions. So if you didn't listen to that podcast, please go to the January 10th edition, either on the healthcarelabyrinth.com website or at leading apps and sites for podcasts. Today on the 17th, we are going to discuss a little bit about what we can expect from President Trump's first 100 days. So we're going to be looking at that on this podcast. And we're sort of asking the question, what will the early months of the new Trump team mean for healthcare? So again, President-elect Donald Trump is scheduled to take office on January 20th after coming back from the political dead. Trump will become just the second president to serve non-consecutive terms. For the politically curious out there like me, the first president to serve non-consecutive terms was Grover Cleveland in 1885 and then again in 1893. Cleveland beat Republican James Blaine in 1884, winning both the electoral and popular votes. Cleveland went on to lose to Republican Benjamin Harrison in 1888. Harrison won the electoral vote, but Cleveland won the popular vote. Then, 4 years later, Cleveland came back to beat Harrison in 1892, getting both the electoral and the popular vote. So that's why when you're reciting the presidents, as I did in my childhood, you always had to go Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland. A now more government-savvy Trump will again become the second president to serve non-consecutive terms, and he has come out fast to put together his agenda and personnel for his second term. This is rather a major difference than what occurred in 2017 when Trump looked very flat-footed during the transition. I honestly believe he was a bit surprised he beat Hillary Clinton in 2016. You could sort of see it on his face as he descended the escalator in Trump Tower. And again, he started out pretty slow, but now he knows a lot more about governance since he served a 4-year term before exiting after his defeat by Joe Biden. Trump already has almost all of his nominees picked and ready for Senate confirmation. He has intervened to help save Mike Johnson as Speaker just recently. He has announced priorities and communicated his overall budget desires to GOP leaders in Congress who now control both chambers. So, what will Trump's first 100 days or so look like? I call this 100 days, but that's just sort of the moniker that is put on a new president or a new leader's sort of probation period, so to speak. What do they do to really sell themselves in office? So this is actually a little more than 100 days. Maybe it could be looked at first half year or so, but nonetheless, we call it the first 100 days. So what will Trump's first 100 days or so look like? Let's start breaking this down into the activities that likely will occur or dominate the headlines in the first 100 days. We'll take our normal 3 breaks, so we'll try to break this up into about 4 parts. Let's talk first about confirmations. Well, Trump will fight for confirmation of his nominees. He seems pretty clear-headed about that. His initial pick for Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, already has dropped out after allegations of sexual impropriety and drug abuse. So far, his other nominees are holding their own. While the president has called for recess appointments, we won't get too much into what that means, but the Senate leaders have wisely pushed back given their commitment to constitutional checks and balances. Democrats likely will seek to hold up some confirmations. The Senate GOP, though, will move forward and get these folks confirmed through the usual advice and consent process. My take is that virtually all of his high-profile nominees will make it through the confirmation process. The ones that look the most vulnerable, though, are Defense Secretary nominee Pete Hegseth and Director of National Intelligence nominee Tulsi Gabbard. While Robert F. Kennedy Jr. holds controversial views on vaccines and in other areas, he too is likely to make it as Secretary of Health and Human Services. The GOP senators have largely kept their powder dry on Kennedy. As well, some Democratic senators, like Pennsylvania's John Fetterman, have signaled support or at least openness on his nomination. Kennedy's maverick views on food have intrigued lawmakers as well, so I think he's going to make it. The other big healthcare nomination is Dr. Mehmet Oz, who is slated to be administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. He actually ran against Fetterman 2 years ago. Oz is somewhat controversial, but I think he'll make it as well. I think the same is true of other prominent healthcare agency nominees. I am particularly looking forward to seeing Dr. Marty Makary lead the Food and Drug Administration. I know Marty a little bit, and Makary will bring clinical and policy expertise to the FDA's operations. The FDA has become a cesspool over the years, in my view. There is a virtual revolving door between the agency and big pharma companies, and Congress is looking at, stopping that revolving door. But Makary will do great things at the FDA. The FDA, in my mind, is not protecting the health of the nation, but lining the pockets of brand drug makers. Makary will bring common sense to drug and food regulation and reform the agency. With that, we're going to take our first break, and we'll be back to continue on some of our discussion of what will happen in the first 100 days. Be right back.
Health plans and insurance are confusing. Our healthcare system is in dire need of reform. Health policy expert Mark Ryan tackles both issues in his book, The Healthcare Labyrinth. It is both a guide to navigating health plans and fixing American health insurance. Mark dives deep into how health plans and the American health insurance system operate. He then outlines a comprehensive reform agenda for the system as a whole, including pricing, emphasizing health and care management, and ensuring affordable access to health coverage in a private delivery model. Mark is a bit of an unconventional Republican in that he believes affordable access is the morally right thing to do, and that it is also fiscally prudent for our nation. Learn more about Mark's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at healthcarelabyrinth.com or search at leading bookseller websites. Available in print, ebook, and audiobook forms.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We're talking about what someone might expect to see in the first 100 days or so of the incoming Trump administration. Our next topic is funding the government after March 14th. Well, funding the government runs out as of March 2025, basically right in the middle on March 14th. And the GOP leaders of Congress need to find a way to fund federal fiscal year 2025 through September 30th. The federal fiscal year runs very odd. It runs from October 1 of a given year to September 30th of the following year. The big question in my mind is, will the GOP be ready to execute on its budget reconciliation process in time? If not, the GOP might be forced to pass another continuing resolution, what is known as a CR, roughly at existing levels of government spending through the end of fiscal year 25. That spending level can then be changed later via the budget reconciliation process I'm going to outline a little later. Let's talk now about the debt limit. The suspension of the debt ceiling technically ended on January 1, 2025. The government now must use all sorts of extraordinary efforts and measures to not impinge on the debt ceiling and yet still borrow to fund government. As most of you know, We have major federal deficits. Our national debt keeps climbing, and we literally run out of cash flow if we don't issue new debt. During the December crisis over passing a continuing resolution through March 14th, 2025, a group of conservative Republicans in the House voted for the bill, but obtained a future commitment from House Speaker Mike Johnson that any movement of the debt ceiling will be tied to major spending cuts in the neighborhood of $2 to $2.5 trillion over a spending horizon. Trump wanted a clean 2-year extension lifting the debt limit in that CR so that he didn't have to deal with it when he took office. But conservatives pushed back. Trump and the conservative lawmakers actually have the same goals here, but different approaches to getting there. Trump is happy to extend the debt limit and push his spending reduction agenda in different ways. He too is worried that no extension complicates his effort to extend his 2017 tax cuts. On the other hand, the conservative lawmakers that held up the original CR before they signed on believe the only way to guarantee spending cuts and control of future debt and deficits is to tie the debt limit lifting to the reduction in spending. They want to see a clear tie between lifting the debt limit and spending cuts. So I sort of understand their philosophy. At the same time, I also understand Trump's philosophy here as well. So there could be a huge battle between Trump and potentially some of these more conservative members in Congress over how to deal with the debt limit. How long the debt limit hike can wait and how it will be addressed are two key points. Again, the Treasury will use extraordinary efforts right now to push out the technical need to borrow from the technical date of January 1st of when that debt limit technically ended. Would conservatives bow to Trump and waive the debt limit for several years outside of a major spending reduction package that likely will be in a reconciliation process that I'm going to outline in a few minutes? That's the big question. Or would they demand that the debt limit conundrum be solved within a broader reconciliation bill that has major spending cuts only? It all depends on whether Trump and perhaps Speaker Mike Johnson can convince them that if the debt limit needs to move up before we run out of money and need to issue debt, that there is a firm commitment from Johnson and Trump that major spending cuts will be in any reconciliation bill. So that's the big debate on the debt limit. And also we talked about how potentially they may have to pass another CR if they're not ready with a reconciliation bill to continue government through the end of September 30th of 25. With that, we will take our second break and we'll get into this big technical issue related to budget reconciliation. Be right back.
Lilac Software is proud to work with the Healthcare Labyrinth website to educate people on the healthcare system. At Lilac, we believe transparency is so important in healthcare. The healthcare system is opaque, and Lilac is trying to bring clarity to data and unleash the best member care, reduce costs, and improve outcomes. Our cloud-native payer platform revolutionizes data insights and analytics. Plans have all the data they need, but in silos locked away in point solutions. At Lilac, we solve the data fragmentation problem and help plans turn complex data into actionable insights, leading to greater operating leverage, tight cost controls, and healthier members. Health plans can improve STAR scores, reduce medical expense, drive revenue, and more. Quite simply, with Lilac, you can drive better business and health outcomes. Learn more at lilacsoftware.com.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We're talking about what to expect in the first 100 days of Donald Trump in a new Republican Congress. So we're now going to go into budget reconciliation, and this gets a little technical. I'll try to keep it simple here. The Senate filibuster or cloture rule creates major impediments to passage of legislation unless there is 60 votes. And in most cases, the Senate usually does not have a supermajority of 60 Republicans or 60 Democrats. In fact, in this latest Senate composition, the Republicans control with 53 votes to Democrats and independents that vote with the Democrats at 47. Again, the rule requires at least 60 votes to pass a bill because any one senator could attempt to filibuster a bill. That means talk all night and all day and the next day and things like that. And it takes at least 60 votes to end that debate. So if you don't have 60 votes in the Senate, theoretically, that filibuster threat anyway stops passages of any bills. Most have championed the filibuster rule as a good check on excess. And in fact, the new Senate Majority Leader, Republican John Thune, has said he will not go after the filibuster because he thinks overall it has great benefit to public policy. It takes out, again, excess in legislation and all these flips and flops when administrations comes in terms of policy. It really is a tool to drive consensus in the more urbane upper chamber, so to speak. But there is a so-called budget reconciliation process that allows budget-related bills to pass with just a simple majority of 51 under Senate rules. This process is often used to pass major budget and other related bills. But in times past, other big-ticket policy items have been passed under that process too. Generally speaking, the budget reconciliation bills must include revenue, spending, or debt limit topics. Reconciliation can be used to make changes in mandatory spending, but not Social Security. Reconciliation cannot be used to change discretionary spending or annual appropriations. The inclusions also cannot increase the federal deficit outside of the traditional window, which is typically measured in 10-year periods. Provisions with no or limited budgetary effect cannot be included. Without getting too far into the weeds, the process has some other limits, very technical in nature, on what can be passed or included. These are called the Byrd Rules over late Senator from West Virginia, Robert Byrd, a Democrat. The Senate parliamentarian rules on whether a given issue or topic can be included in a reconciliation bill, and it requires 60 votes of the chamber to overrule the parliamentarian. So again, not everything can be included in these budget bills, but they have found ways in the past to sort of stretch rules and get things through based on a majority-only vote. The reconciliation process, as I note, often lowers overall deficits, but sometimes it is used to increase spending. These are generally limited to one bill per year, one reconciliation bill per year, but the Congress has yet to act formally on federal fiscal year 2025. They have not passed a budget technically, only a continuing resolution. This opens up the possibility of the GOP Congress and Trump using reconciliation 3 times in the next 9+ months. One tied to federal fiscal year 25 as of now, one for federal fiscal year 2026 very soon, and one technically even for federal fiscal year 2027 beginning after October 1, 2025. So the Republicans in many ways have many bites at the apple at certain times to pass with a majority vote in the Senate and thus in the House some fairly big budget measures that will likely include some pretty major budget cuts. This process of budget reconciliation has been used by both Democrats and Republicans for budgets and, again, policy reforms. Under George H.W. Bush, reconciliation was used to pass a budget in 1990. That was sort of H.W. Bush's undoing because that violated his tax pledge. Under Bill Clinton, a number of budget and tax measures were passed using reconciliation, as was welfare reform. Under George W. Bush, several more budget and tax packages passed under reconciliation. Under Obama, pieces of Obamacare needed a reconciliation bill, even though the Base Affordable Care Act was actually not passed via reconciliation. Under Donald Trump 45, his tax cuts passed as a reconciliation measure. Those were the tax cuts of 2017. Joe Biden was able to get his economic stimulus package called the American Rescue Plan passed through reconciliation. And the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in 2022 also was a reconciliation bill. So you can see that Democrats and Republicans have historically used this reconciliation process to pass these types of measures with just a majority vote in the Senate, bypassing the filibuster rule and the cloture rule that requires 60 votes. As with previous administrations, Trump is looking to a reconciliation bill to reduce spending and extend his 2017 tax cuts. But with tight GOP vote counts in the House and to some degree in the Senate, crafting a measure or measures will be delicate. Just to refresh your memory, the GOP won the House 220 to 215 in terms of seats, but Matt Gaetz has resigned and two other lawmakers could resign to take positions in the Trump administration. So that could bring the House GOP majority to 217 to 215 for a period of time until those seats are filled. In the Senate, again, it's 53-47, but there are two fairly moderate GOP lawmakers in the Senate who sometimes balk at certain types of policy decisions. So again, that sort of means that things are a bit volatile and a bit delicate in this reconciliation process, even though only a majority is needed now in each chamber. So the big questions for reconciliation are, first, how many bills will there be? And second, how deep the cuts will be. On the first issue of how many bills will be, the big question is whether there will be one or two reconciliation bills. Some Republicans, especially in the Senate, support two reconciliation bills. Their first bill would tackle current budget issues, immigration, the border, defense, and some repeals of Democratic policies. The second would encompass the larger tax cut extension, ongoing budget issues, and the major spending reductions. The House is more divided in terms of the GOP on how many bills to pass. Some GOP members of the House favor a two-bill process like the Senate, while conservatives in the House Freedom Caucus favor one megabill. Trump appears to like the one megabill concept as well. Part of the Freedom Caucus's members' views on one bill only ties to distrust of the leadership to keep commitments and deliver on spending reductions. It is a fair bet that the GOP will get one or more reconciliation bills passed, and they will include significant spending cuts. We just don't know how deep. But when the bills will pass and how big these bills will be are still really open questions. It is fair to say that one big mega bill would take time, and that runs directly into the federal fiscal year 25 government shutdown issue and perhaps debt limit timeframes. So all of this is sort of coming together with a great deal of uncertainty in terms of timing. With that, we'll take our last break and we'll come back to continue on our discussion of significant issues we can expect in the first 100 days or so of the new Trump administration. Be right back.
The Healthcare Labyrinth is no ordinary website. It features news and commentary from one of the nation's leading healthcare policy and technology experts. Mark Ryan combs the internet for the latest healthcare news and publishes a news feed each weekday with summations and Mark's insights. Twice a week, Mark publishes a blog to go deep into a current issue. And of course, Mark hosts a podcast each week to delve even further. All of this is available at healthcarelabyrinth.com. Visit each day for the latest happenings in healthcare. As well, learn more about Mark's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at the website. That's healthcarelabyrinth.com, your go-to source for healthcare news.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We're talking about what to expect in the first 100 days or so of the Trump administration. So far, we've tackled some pretty major issues. We've talked about confirmations, funding the government after March 14th, the debt limit controversy, and the very arcane budget reconciliation process. We're now going to move on to Doge. And in this place, I'm not talking about the Doge's Palace in Venice, but what is proposed by Trump to be the so-called Department of Government Efficiency Commission. And tied to much of the process that I just discussed is Trump's proposal for this Doge Commission. It will not be a permanent government agency as you might think, but again, just a commission that would only be around for a year or two. It will be led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Some in Congress are suspicious of Doge and think it could usurp congressional authority. But Republicans are generally supportive of the effort and are looking for ways to tie congressional appropriations decisions with the Doge process. In some cases, Doge committees will be set up to work collaboratively with the executive branch. Doge's mandate is fairly bold. Trump wants the commission to dismantle bureaucracy, restructure agencies and government, cut wasteful spending, and slash regulations. In essence, Trump wants to remake Washington. Doge wants to hit the ground running and bring huge and expansive lists of cuts to the table. Doge could rely on proposals from various conservative think tanks, the House Study Committee, the Congressional Budget Office, congressional advisor panels like MedPAC and MacPAC, the president's own proposals, and many more sources. I see the major problem being that Doge's rumored deadline for report lands in mid-26, right before the midterm elections. The GOP will have a hard time passing major changes in election year. And if you agree on the tax cuts, most spending reductions would be needed well before then. So maybe this Doge process will be accelerated. Let's now turn to regulatory changes that we can expect from Trump in the first part of 2025. As with most administrations when the party in control changes, Trump will come and immediately freeze or reverse a lot of what the Biden administration did. Trump can use numerous mechanisms to do so. First, there are a number of pending regulations that have not yet been finalized by the Biden administration. He could simply freeze these regulations and never finalize them. Number two, portions of pending regulations could be purged while other parts are finalized. Number three, he can use the regulatory process himself to enact new rules that repeal parts or all of given regulations that have been finalized. There is yet another vehicle that is likely to be used as well, since the GOP controls both chambers now. The Congressional Review Act provides Congress with fast-track authority to overturn recently issued regulations. While the CRA can be used at any time, the act is most applicable in the look-back period following presidential transitions. The look-back period begins 60 working days before the end of a session of Congress. Regulations issued between that day and the beginning of the subsequent session of Congress are available for review in the new session of Congress. Trump will request the GOP to extinguish certain regulations, and Congress can simply expunge them. Trump thinks he has a great shot to truly rein in agency regulations and such activity, largely due to trends in the courts. At least 2 major Supreme Court decisions this year restricted the authority of executive agencies to issue regulations and the scope of their authority. The High Court argued the agencies and bureaucracies engaged in huge overreach. One High Court ruling said agencies usurped Congress's power and struck down its so-called Chevron deference opinion that the higher court issued a number of decades ago. Let's move on to another arcane subject before we conclude the podcast. It's called impoundment. So this is an ultra nerdy topic from a former state budget director here. So again, one other budget cutting tool could also come into play. Trump insists that he has the authority to impound funds. He wants to use the interpreted power to restrict certain expenditures and rein in the bureaucracy. Some congressional Republicans are proposing changes to what's known as the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 that they say limits the president's authority to withhold appropriations. The act was actually passed in that year specifically to rein in some of Richard Nixon's widespread impoundment practices. Congress wanted to reassert its right to control appropriation decision-making. What the law does is require a president to submit proposed impoundment lists to Congress for Congress's sign-off. The Congressional Budget Office says the 1974 Act and process established actually allowed impoundment with congressional consent. Otherwise, it was really sort of extra legal by the president. It says repealing the process will not mean far-reaching authority for the president. Courts seem to have sided with the CBO in this interpretation, in that Richard Nixon did not really have the far-reaching authority to withhold funds. We don't know if the changes to the Impoundment Act would be passed by Congress, but Trump could attempt to use impoundment in a number of forms and challenge Congress on the issue. I think we could see litigation on this issue in 2025. I tend to doubt, though, that even a conservative court would side with the president on this. I see it as a major checks and balances in separation of powers issue. With that, we will conclude this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks for joining Mark and the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. Go to healthcarelabyrinth.com each day for the latest healthcare news. See you next week on the next Healthcare Labyrinth podcast.